was always one of my favorite novels in my youth, so I was really surprised to find that this time around I didn't like it as much. But that's not to say it's a bad novel. Early on in King's career, he started releasing books under the pseudonym Richard Bachman. He did it for two reasons. One was that it allowed him to release multiple books per year, and the other was that he was curious just how much of his sales were related to his name and not the value of the books themselves. King has stated that Bachman was outed too early in order for him to fully see whether or not his suspicions were right. However, it still provided him with the inspiration to write this novel. A writer drops his pen name in an effort to stop writing the gritty crime novels he's become famous for, and that pen name comes to life and starts murdering those who were responsible for his quote-unquote death. The story takes a bit of a turn in the latter half of the novel, suddenly becoming a little more supernatural when we find out that both men cannot exist on the same Earth at the same time, and that George Stark has actually come to take over Thad Beaumont's life. Too bad he didn't notice all the sparrows. I think it was that change in direction that made it a little harder for me to love it this time. While we know very early on that this is the real George Stark and not just a copycat killer, the rules of how his existence works don't get explained until that latter half when suddenly it's so important. While the sparrows appear early on, it seems a little odd that Stark shows no signs of decay at all while he's on his killing spree. While it would be an interesting concept to say that it was the killing that was keeping him alive, there's nothing in the narrative to suggest that. Instead, it's just that he starts falling apart when the story needs him to. What makes me enjoy the book more than anything are the characters. Liz is strong and tough and just the right element of sassy. Thad is a realistic protagonist, one that makes it incredibly easy for you to put yourself in his place and consider how you would react in the situation. And Alan, whose appearance is all too brief, still feels so fully formed and real. It's no wonder King revisited him later in Needful Things. He is a leading man, this just isn't his story yet. When I saw this movie in my teens, I knew virtually nothing about the horror genre. So it was a very pleasant surprise this time around to see that this film was adapted and directed by George Romero, best known for his Living Dead films. Romero and King are also friends, having worked together before this film on Creepshow. I saw a fantastic quote from King from a Time magazine interview where he was asked about the many adaptations of his work and whether he tries to maintain control over them. I'd go crazy. I don't try to maintain quality control. Except I try to get good people involved. The thing is, when you put together a script, a director, and all the other variables, you never really know what's going to come out. And so you start with the idea that it's like a baseball game. You put the best team you can on the field, and you know that, more times than not, you're gonna win. There's no doubt that this film was an example of King building that good team. He put the film in the capable hands of Romero and just sat back and let him do all the work. So was his trust well founded? In my opinion, definitely. While this isn't a straight-up perfect adaptation, it is very close. Some things were moved around in the story and others omitted, but mostly in a way that makes logical sense. Romero clearly saw a correlation between King and Thad Beaumont, because he actually has one of Thad's early stories be called Here There Be Tigers, which is one of King's stories. It's a simple wink and a nod to die-hard fans that you just have to appreciate. While the novels start at the point in the present day where Thad has revealed that he is George Stark, it makes perfect sense for the movie to start with Fred Clausen confronting him instead. There's no real need to slow the momentum of the film down with a flashback later on. The one thing I will say is that the anger Beaumont shows to Clausen seems a little out of character with the timid man we see in the book. But since we can't get inside of his head and see the anger that he hides, it makes perfect sense. Some of the characters get changed around. A female photographer in the book is melded with Homer Gamache, who now has a prosthetic leg instead of arm. This gives a better motivation for Homer's death, and the end result is just as gruesome and tragic. Raleigh de Lesseps in the book becomes Reggie in the film, and is changed from male to female. The gender of the character is irrelevant, and there's just something so cool about a woman who smokes a pipe. Julie Harris is both funny and charming in the role. But what is amazing is the characters that don't get left out. Stephen King has a way of sometimes introducing very minor characters in his stories who will only show up for like one chapter and then disappear forever. But he makes them so vivid and real by giving them realistic human traits. State Trooper Warren Hamilton is exactly the kind of character who would normally get left out of a movie adaptation, as he appears for one chapter and then is never seen again. But then we wouldn't get to hear this fantastic line.
Ask Mom if she believes this.
Ditto for Clausen's landlord. They could have just cast anyone, but this woman looks exactly like the ex-call girl King describes in the novel. In the book, Stark is repeatedly described as having blonde hair, but here he looks exactly like Beaumont, but with his hair slicked back in a greaser style. While in the book Stark's looks are based on Beaumont's imagination, it makes perfect sense for them to look alike and be played by the same person, since they are technically maternal twins. One added scene that I found a little odd was where Stark calls Alan on the phone. It serves to show us just how jumpy this whole situation is making Alan, but I think it's supposed to just be him imagining things. At least it must be, because Stark shows absolutely no interest in Alan otherwise, and Alan doesn't even show up at the cabin until the very last minute. Michael Rooker gives a good performance in the film, even if I hear his voice and automatically think of Mallrats now. But I have to admit that I don't love this Alan as much as I do the one in the book. His role is largely minimized. This is probably why when I read the book, I was picturing Ed Harris instead. The movie helps to eliminate his importance by having Thad go directly to see his doctor rather than having Alan call him, and I can't really argue against this change. The only part of it that doesn't make sense is when Stark appears in the room at the same exact time, kills the doc, stares at Beaumont for a moment, and then leaves. Why not confront him at this point? Before his death, the doctor also tells Thad that his parents buried the remains of his mostly eaten twin, which is a change from the book where his parents had no idea it was anything other than a tumor. However, burying the remains in the cemetery plot is a nice way to try to explain how the spirit of Stark could have used some kind of material to build himself with, and might also explain why he's losing cohesion. He made a lot out of very little, and he needs energy from Beaumont to make himself whole. While Stark's decay doesn't look anywhere near as gross as it did in the book, I still think it's done well and provides Hutton with the chance to portray emotion without being buried under prosthetics. I also can't help but think that he goes from looking like Michael Keaton to Tom Waits in the midst of his transformations, but maybe that's just me. One of the great advantages to film is that while in the book King can tell us that Thad's dreams resemble the reality that later plays out at the end of the book, here Romero can frame the shots exactly to show us the parallels.
You
must play a part. Fate had me playing in love. This is my sweetheart.
It creates such a great sense of relief for both us and Thad when he sees Liz still alive. It also helps that Hutton and Amy Madigan really feel like a real loving couple just trying to raise their children throughout the film. Their relationship is very understated, but also very sweet. Another thing Romero deserves credit for is not resorting to the often silly-looking split-frame effect once Stark and Beaumont are in the same room. Creative angles and body doubles are used up to the point where they stand across from each other in the office. There's also one moment later where they manage to layer the men on top of each other, and I think it looks really fantastic. It's understandable that we never really see the full mass of sparrows that are described over and over again in the book, but I think they represented it as best as they could. While it's obvious they are using an effect to fill the sky with birds, it doesn't look that bad. The final fight between Thad and Stark may be a little more physical, but from a movie perspective, that makes sense. I just wish they hadn't gone for the fake-out death. I am so beyond tired of that in horror films at this point. Regardless, Stark gets picked apart by the birds, and if possible, this is even more gruesome than the book version. I don't know how the agoraphobe I was as a teenager sat through that whole scene with my eyes open. As the Hatchet fan that I am now, still had trouble with it. I was squirming in my seat, and it was such a wonderful relief when that bloody ribcage was finally carried off by the sparrows into the netherworld. As if it isn't incredibly obvious by this point, I love this adaptation. It's accurate, it has a great cast, and it makes a fun and gruesome film. If you haven't seen it before, I highly recommend it. Next time, I'll be looking at the short story Trucks and its 2 different film adaptations, one that was directed by Stephen King himself.